All right, everyone. Today we're diving into a really fundamental question in our field. How authentic are the listening passages in the high-stakes tests our students are taking? We're going to break down a fascinating 2024 study by Hitoshi Nishizawa that gives us a brand new, data-driven way to think about this.
I mean, really think about it for a second. When a student puts on those headphones for a TOEFL or IELTS exam, are they listening to something that genuinely sounds like a university lecture, or is it a polished, perfectly clean, almost robotic version of what they'll actually face in the classroom? That's the core question we're tackling today.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll outline the authenticity problem itself. Then we'll look at how a new corpus was built to get a baseline for reality. We'll decode what spoken fluency actually is, and then the fun part, we'll put the tests head-to-head with real-world lectures. Finally, we'll look at some new proposed standards and talk about what it all means for us.
All right, so let's jump right in. First things first, why should we, as assessment specialists, even care about this idea of authenticity? Well, it turns out it's not just an academic talking point. It's right at the heart of what makes a test valid and fair.
The key term we're wrestling with here is situational authenticity. It goes way back to Bachman, but it basically boils down to this. Does the language on the test actually sound and feel like the language in the real-world situation it's pretending to be? In this case, an academic lecture.
And look, this is the really crucial part. Authenticity isn't just a nice-to-have. It's everything. It's fundamental to validity. If the test isn't real, what are we even measuring? It drives washback. Teachers and students will study what's on the test. And maybe most importantly, if the audio is too clean, it might not even trigger the same brain processes needed for real-life listening.
Now, people have looked at authenticity before, right? There's been great work on grammar and vocabulary, but Nishizawa spotted a huge gap in the research. Nobody had really systematically measured the temporal features. You know, the speed, the pauses, the oops, let me rephrase that moments, all the stuff that makes speech sound human.
So, how do you even begin to study something that hasn't really been measured before? Well, you have to build the right tool for the job. And that's exactly what this study did, by creating a new benchmark for what reality actually sounds like.
And I love this because the goal here wasn't just theoretical or abstract. As the author says directly, the whole point was to give test developers concrete, objective data that can actually use to make their tests better and more realistic.
And believe me, this was no small feat. The researcher built what's called the Fluency Corpus of Academic English Lectures, or FCAL. They took 100 real lecture videos from 28 different universities, pulled a random 6-minute clip from each, and made sure it was all balanced. The result? A 10-hour corpus of the real thing, a much more robust baseline than we've ever had before.
Okay, so we've got the corpus, we have our baseline for reality, now what? Well, now you have to figure out what to measure. The study broke down this vague idea of fluency into 14 very specific, very measurable features of speech.
And all 14 of these measures fit pretty neatly into 3 big buckets. First, you've got speed, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then you have breakdown. Think of all the pauses, the silences, the ums and ahs. And finally, you've got repair, which is all the little self-corrections and restarts we make when we talk.
But here's where it gets really fascinating, because not all pauses are created equal, right? A pause at the end of a sentence, an end clause pause, that's just natural phrasing. But a pause in the middle of a thought, a mid-clause pause, that often shows the speaker is thinking, searching for a word. It's a key signature of spontaneous, unscripted speech. Or take a look at this, a classic example of a repair. The speaker starts to say one thing, it became, and then nope, pivots midstream, remain to be. We do this constantly, without even thinking about it. So the big question is, how often does this actually show up on a language test?
And that brings us to the main event, the data showdown. We've got our reality benchmark, the FCAL. Now let's put the TOEFL and IELTS lecture passages right up against it and see what the data tells us.
Whoa. Okay, just look at this. Remember those mid-clause pauses we just talked about? The ones that show real-time thinking? In authentic lectures, they happen about 8.5 times per minute, but in TOEFL, less than 4. That's a massive gap. IELTS is a little closer, but still way off.
And it gets even more dramatic when you look at repetitions. You know, when a speaker repeats a word or phrase to get their thoughts straight? It happens all the time in real life, almost twice a minute. TOEFL has a tiny fraction of that, but IELTS, well, the data for IELTS is really something else.
That's right, 0. That's not a typo. Across all 49 of the IELTS lectures that were analyzed, there was not a single repetition. A completely normal, everyday feature of human speech was just gone, wiped clean from the record.
Okay, so it's easy to point out the problems, right? But what's great about this research is that it doesn't just stop there. It actually offers a constructive solution, a practical guide for test developers to aim for.
The idea is pretty smart. Instead of just aiming for an average, which could be misleading, the proposal is to aim for the normal range. Let's look at the middle 50% of the data from real lectures, from the 25th to the 75th percentile, and use that as a reasonable target. So a realistic lecture should probably have between, say, half a repetition and 2 repetitions per minute. It gives test makers a clear goal.
So with these new, reasonable targets in place, how did the actual tests do? Well, it's not a pretty picture. For TOEFL, only 30% of their passages had a normal number of repetitions, and a mere 6% had an authentic frequency of those critical mid-clause pauses. Just, wow.
And here is the final jaw-dropping stat. What percentage of test passages from either TOEFL or IELTS fell within the authentic range for all 14 of these fluency measures? 0%. Not a single test passage that was analyzed could be considered fully authentic in terms of its timing and rhythm. Not one.
So, we've seen all this data, all these charts, it's pretty damning. But we have to ask the most important question. So what? Why does any of this actually matter? In the real world, for researchers, for teachers, and especially for students? Well, the implications are huge. For test developers, it's a clear call to action. You need to incorporate the natural messiness of speech. For those of you doing SLA research, it means we have to be really careful about using these test materials and claiming our findings generalize. And for students, this is where it gets serious. There's a real danger of negative washback. They practice with this super clean audio and then are completely unprepared for a real professor who pauses and ums and corrects themselves. And that leaves us with a pretty tough question to sit with, something Nishizawa brings up from his own experience. If the very tests we use as gatekeepers to higher education are this disconnected from reality, are we accidentally setting our students up to fail before they even get a chance to succeed? That's a question I think everyone in our field needs to take very, very seriously.